In 1965, when Harlem was a volatile mix of political corruption, power struggles, and racial injustice, Mayor Thomas H. Blake made a decision that would seal his fate. He thought his position made him untouchable. He believed that, with his connections, he could manipulate the city's power structure to control Bumpy Johnson's empire. But he was gravely mistaken. Mayor Blake, blinded by ambition and hunger for political power, betrayed the trust of Harlem's kingpin for a favor that would propel him to even greater heights. He struck a deal with Bumpy's enemies, hoping to sideline the legendary gangster for good. Blake thought that Bumpy, with his extensive operations in Harlem, could be used as a pawn. What he didn't know was that his act of betrayal would lead to his own downfall, a downfall so swift and absolute that within 72 hours, the mayor would be found begging for his life in the very place he had once held dominion. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a man of power, he was a man of honor. And when that honor was violated, there was only one way to deal with it. In just 72 hours, Mayor Blake would come to understand that in Bumpy's world, betrayal wasn't just punished, it was erased. Mayor Thomas H. Blake was the embodiment of political power. A tall, commanding man in his late 50s, Blake wore his authority like a crown, his posture always upright, his suit impeccable. To the public, he was a man who fought for justice, for the betterment of Harlem, a politician who was doing what needed to be done to improve the lives of his people. But beneath this facade lay a man driven by ambition and the desire for more. Blake was a man who believed that politics was a game of chess, where every pawn could be sacrificed for a higher position. He was a man who could cut deals with the devil if it meant securing his legacy. His power didn't come from the people. It came from those he could manipulate behind the scenes, using fear, money, and promises to get what he wanted. He controlled the political machines of Harlem, made deals with powerful businessmen, and used his position to silence anyone who stood in his way. His dealings with Bumpy Johnson, at first, were always cordial. Blake played the game of respect, knowing that Bumpy ran the streets and controlled Harlem's underworld. But when Blake saw an opportunity to climb higher in the political world, he decided that Bumpy, a man of honor, could be pushed aside. He saw an ally in the city's rivals, in the corrupt factions that were eager to bring Bumpy down. And so, Blake made a deal. In that moment, Blake's arrogance blinded him. He underestimated the power of loyalty, the strength of Bumpy's connections, and the price of crossing a man who was more than just a gangster. He was a legend. And Blake would soon learn that crossing Bumpy Johnson meant crossing a line that no politician, no matter how powerful, could survive. Blake's betrayal wasn't just a threat to Bumpy, it was a direct attack on the very foundation of respect and loyalty that Bumpy had built over the years. Harlem, for all its struggles, was a community that had lived by a code: respect the streets, respect the people, and above all, respect Bumpy Johnson. The mayor's actions threatened to undo everything Bumpy had worked for, and in doing so, Blake set in motion his own demise. Bumpy didn't rule through fear alone, he ruled through respect. His empire was built on loyalty, and betrayal was the one thing Bumpy could never forgive. When Blake chose political power over his honor, Bumpy knew that he had no choice but to make an example of him. The stakes were high. Not only had Blake betrayed Bumpy personally, but he had also threatened the balance of Harlem itself. The betrayal struck at the heart of Bumpy's values. It wasn't just about politics. It was about honor. And Bumpy had always maintained that anyone who dared cross him would pay the price. Blake's actions, driven by ambition, threatened everything Bumpy had built in Harlem, and now there would be consequences. The moral line had been crossed. The question wasn't whether Bumpy would retaliate. It was when and how. The confrontation was inevitable, and the outcome would leave a mark on the community that would never be forgotten. It started when Blake, eager to secure his political future, approached the mayoral elections with more than just the usual promises. He struck a secret deal with some of Bumpy's biggest enemies, promising them a seat at the table if they helped him dismantle Bumpy's influence. Blake thought he could have it all: power, control, and the streets of Harlem in his pocket. Blake's plan was simple: push Bumpy out of Harlem by leveraging his political influence to undermine the kingpin's operations. He thought that Bumpy would bow to the pressure, that the streets would bend to his will. But what Blake didn't know was that Bumpy was always one step ahead. Blake believed that a few key moves in the political arena could take down Bumpy. He was wrong. Bumpy, always watching, soon learned of the mayor's betrayal. He had eyes everywhere, and when the whispers of Blake's secret dealings reached him, Bumpy's response was measured but firm. Bumpy wasn't a man to act in haste, but he also wasn't a man to let slights go unanswered. While Blake made plans to solidify his control over the city, Bumpy made plans of his own. He wasn't going to let this betrayal slide. The mayor had made a mistake, one that would cost him dearly. But Bumpy was no fool. He wasn't going to take revenge with a rash move. His revenge would be calculated, precise, and delivered when Blake thought he was safe. The news reached Bumpy in a quiet moment, a rare time when he wasn't surrounded by business or strategy. The betrayal hit him like a slow burn. It didn't anger him. It didn't make him lose his composure. It made him think. And Bumpy was a thinker. He understood that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about sending a message. Bumpy's response was measured and calm. He didn't need to lash out. He needed to make sure that when Blake fell, it would be swift and final. The mayor had overestimated his position. He thought he could use the system to crush a man like Bumpy, but Bumpy knew better than to take a fight to the political arena. No, this was a street fight, and Bumpy had the upper hand. "I'm going to tell you something once," Bumpy said to his closest men. "When you disrespect me, when you think you can use my name for your own gain, there's only one way this ends. And it's not with a handshake." Bumpy's men knew exactly what he meant. The mayor had crossed a line, and now the city would bear witness to Bumpy's response. For Blake, the waiting game was his greatest mistake. He continued with his political maneuvering, unaware that the trap was already closing around him. He believed his deal with Bumpy's rivals would secure his re-election, that he could finally push Bumpy out of the city and solidify his power. But Blake didn't realize that Bumpy was watching and waiting. As the days passed, Bumpy's men moved quietly, setting the pieces in place. The false sense of security that Blake carried with him was palpable. He went about his daily routine, meeting with donors, shaking hands, and thinking that he had already won. The tension, however, was palpable. The air around Blake grew thick, and every step he took toward securing his power brought him closer to the reckoning Bumpy had in store. As Blake basked in his political games, Bumpy calmly prepared his revenge. The final pieces were falling into place, but Blake remained oblivious to the danger creeping ever closer. Bumpy's plan was meticulous. Each detail was planned with precision, every move calculated to ensure Blake would pay the price for his treachery. Bumpy's men had gathered information, watching Blake's every move, every interaction. They knew exactly where Blake would be, who he would meet, and what he would do next. Blake's sense of invincibility was his greatest weakness. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He had made his alliances, signed his deals, and was on the verge of securing his future in Harlem. He believed Bumpy was a thing of the past, someone who could be manipulated or pushed aside for political gain. But as the clock ticked down, Bumpy knew better. He knew the power of patience, of waiting for the perfect moment. The 72-hour deadline was nearly up, and Blake's time was running out. Bumpy's trap was simple. It would be a reminder to Blake, and to anyone else who thought they could cross Bumpy Johnson, that no one was untouchable. The mayor's false sense of security would be shattered when he least expected it, and when the trap was sprung, Blake would learn the price of his betrayal. It was the third day, the final day, when Blake walked into his office, still unaware of the storm about to hit. The day had started like any other. Meetings, phone calls, planning. He felt the weight of his power. The mayor of Harlem, the man who had finally outwitted Bumpy Johnson. Or so he thought. But as Blake settled into his chair, there was a subtle shift in the air, a tension he couldn't place. He didn't notice the men who had quietly entered his building or the carefully orchestrated movements that surrounded him. He didn't see the quiet signals exchanged between Bumpy's men, their eyes locked on their target. The door to Blake's office opened, and in walked Bumpy Johnson. The silence in the room was thick, the tension unbearable. Blake looked up, his heart skipping a beat as he saw Bumpy standing there, calm, collected, and unyielding. There was no threat in Bumpy's stance, no shout of rage. He simply looked at Blake, his eyes cold but filled with an undeniable authority. "Do you know who I am?" Blake asked, trying to regain control of the situation. "I know exactly who you are," Bumpy replied, his voice low and steady, "and I know exactly what you did." Blake, realizing he had underestimated Bumpy, took a step back. His mind raced, trying to calculate his next move, but he had no time to react. Before he could make a move, Bumpy's men closed in. There were no words, no struggle, just the swift precision of Bumpy's response. In the span of just 30 seconds, Blake's entire world collapsed. He went from the mayor of Harlem to a man who now understood the price of crossing Bumpy Johnson. In that moment, Blake realized he had sealed his fate. Justice came swiftly. Blake, once untouchable in his political seat, now found himself stripped of everything he had worked for. The trap Bumpy had set was simple, effective, and devastating. Blake was taken to the very heart of Harlem, his power stripped from him, and there, in front of those who had once supported him, he was forced to beg for his life. Bumpy didn't waste words. His men held Blake, and as the mayor knelt before him, begging for mercy, Bumpy gave him only one response. "You thought you could take my city," Bumpy said, his voice carrying the weight of years of loyalty and respect. "But you've forgotten one thing. You never play the game without paying the price." In that moment, Blake understood. He had crossed the line, and Bumpy had made sure that he paid the price. The mayor's future, once bright with political power, was now shattered. His fate was sealed by his own ambition, and the lesson would be remembered by everyone who heard the story. Blake's desperation was palpable, but it was too late. Bumpy's justice was not about revenge. It was about making sure that the streets remained in balance, and in that balance, there was no place for men like Blake, who thought they could manipulate their way to power. Blake's political career ended that day, but it was more than just a political defeat. It was a public humiliation. The once mighty mayor of Harlem was reduced to nothing more than a pawn in a game of power that he had tried to manipulate. His begging for mercy would be etched into the minds of those who had once believed in him. In Harlem, the news spread quickly. The streets had witnessed the swift retribution of a man who valued loyalty above all else. Blake was no longer a figure of power. He was a cautionary tale. The people of Harlem, who had once been manipulated by his promises, now understood the price of betrayal. The legend of Bumpy Johnson grew even more powerful as the story of Blake's fall spread like wildfire. For Bumpy, there was no satisfaction in Blake's downfall. Justice had been served, and the balance of Harlem had been restored. There was no room for political games in Bumpy's world, only respect. And those who sought to disrupt that order would find themselves just like Blake, broken and begging for mercy. Bumpy's legacy was solidified once again. Harlem knew who ruled the streets, and anyone who thought they could play a different game learned that the price of betrayal was steep. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson stories that history forgot. The moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem. And in the comments, tell me, what would you have done if you were in Bumpy's shoes? Would you have let Blake go, or would you have dealt with him like Bumpy did? More legendary stories coming next. Don't miss it.